Our speaker tonight, Deacon Evan, is not particularly an expert on the topic that we're about to be, and that's the truth. But he and I share an experience, and that is an experience of being in seminary and going to Kenya with the OCMC, which is the Orthodox Christian Mission Center. And gaining great perspective, I think, and enrichment through that. So this is the first of two adult eds that he's going to teach as a course of his internship. And the second one, he picked the topic. This one, I picked the topic. And we pray that God will use you to edify us about the state of Orthodoxy in the African continent and sort of how we got there. So may it be blessed.
Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever.
So like Father said, I'm not particularly an expert in this, but this is information that I've gathered and that I believe is accurate to the extent of my knowledge. So let us begin. We're going to start with an early history of Africa, Christianity in Africa. Not going to get too in depth with any of these pieces, but it began in the first century, where the apostle and evangelist Mark had been the one sent to northern Africa to evangelize the people there and to spread the gospel. This includes the establishment of the See of Alexandria in 62 AD, and the early persecutions and all things considered, it wasn't until the second century that really Christianity had more of a foothold in the native population of the Egyptians, in contrast to kind of the nobility and the leaders of the Roman Empire, being the Greco-Romans. And in the 3rd to the 4th century is when Alexandrian Christianity really started to gain prominence in the Byzantine Empire. And again, not getting into too many details, but there was a bump when Alexandria was originally the second in honor amongst the sees, the ancient Christian patriarchates, but became third when Constantinople was given patriarchate and ascended in that regard, which contributed to some issues and some tensions in the church between the two patriarchates. But we also see that Alexandria and northern Egypt was the source of a lot of problems, such as the Arian controversy, which was a catalyst for the First Ecumenical Council to take place, as well as the schisms with the Donatists and Novatians and more. But it's also the source of some of the greatest saints in our church. We have St. Athanasius the Great, who came out of the controversy at the First Ecumenical Council, where he was a deacon, wrote the great works defending the doctrine of the Incarnation, as well as St. Anthony the Great, who is one of the first widely recognized monastic fathers in the church, as well as a lot of the other desert fathers, St. Augustine and others that came at this, as well as other great thinkers of the church, such as the first, one of the founders of Latin theology is Tertullian and Origen, which had some influence with some of the Cappadocians and so forth. So after some time, after the Ecumenical Council in Chalcedon, there was a split in the Church of Alexandria, where much of the native population had rejected the council and its theology, and this became the split between the non-Chalcedonian Oriental Orthodox churches as the Orthodox churches, canonical Orthodox churches of which we are part. They had a little bit of rivalry sending missions to Nubia, but much of the fruit of that was kind of squashed by Islamic conquest. But Ethiopia, a noteworthy church, is in communion with the Coptic Church, the non-Macedonians, which was evangelized in the 4th century and is still present there today with a good amount of thriving. So, like I was saying, Islam came by, which was largely a factor that led the churches into a state of survival. There wasn't a whole lot of missionary activity into larger parts of Africa, but they were rather just trying to get by in a lot of ways. So we don't see a whole lot of records, not really any records of Christianity south of the Saharan desert before the 7th century. In the 7th century, there were some people that fled, both pagans and Christians alike, that fled northern Africa down south, but there's also a lot of warfare between the sub-Saharan Africans and Islamic conquest. So there wasn't a whole lot going on with foreign interaction. That way we don't see a lot of Christian records until the 18th century, which brings us closer to the modern times. And the bulk of this, what I'm going to present, is more from the 18th century onwards, which is what we're going to see here. So Archbishop Macarius, a great mission worker in field work in Africa, has said that the opening up of Africa was largely from David Livingstone, and a lot of it came from Roman Catholic and Protestant missionaries who also brought, technology, healthcare, different things for the welfare of the people. We might have or hear some criticism of the Orthodox. Why weren't you in Africa at this time? Well, the Orthodox Church was much more active in Eurasia, out of Siberia, and Japan, China, Alaska. So it wasn't that we were inactive, but just active in different geographical regions of the world. In some context, historically, is the African continent largely being a object of European powers for the sake of gathering resources and to establish themselves in prominence. So a lot of Africa was carved up between various European powers, such as the British, that have some prominence for a lot of Eastern Africa and the South. We'll see that as we go through some of the details. There was some Greek presence, especially in Southern Africa, but that didn't really blossom forth much missionary activity. There's a lot of communities keeping to themselves rather than blossoming out elsewhere. So we're going to go a bit, kind of jump around the continent. It is a large continent, so we're not going to cover all of it by any means, but we're going to do a kind of some examples and a little bit of an overview of some places, starting with South Africa. South Africa in 1908 saw a little bit of a change in kind of the model of a Greek priest coming and just serving the Greek community there as kind of a personal chaplain. In 1908, Father Nicodemus Sarakas was sent there to tend to the Greek community, and that's what the Greek community really intended for him. But he really had eyes to expand, to spread the gospel outside of just that Greek community. But the community was not on the same page with him, which led to, that was a factor rather, to Father Nicodemus leaving and going north to Tanzania. An important factor, maybe less so for South Africa itself, for any thriving Orthodox community that joined the canonical church, but something that is more important for other places in Africa, is the so-called African Orthodox Church. This formed out of some disillusioned Methodists and Anglicans, as well as sentiments after World War I in the United States, with a rise in ideas of Black independence and Black nationalism, and largely from George Alexander McGuire, who is pictured here. He has an interesting past and interesting history that we're not going to cover in depth, but he was baptized an Anglican in his childhood, educated by the Moravians, did a lot of work with the Episcopal Church, and eventually left that to be part of the Black nationalist movement with the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He had himself disagreed with the leader. They had some tension between the two of them, which led to him leaving, because the organization did not have a direct church affiliation, but McGuire wanted that and thought there should be a universal church for Africans, whereas the leadership did not want such a close association with a So he had established this African Orthodox Church in 1921 with that intent to be a universal church for Africans, and was declared the bishop of the local people. But he was not satisfied with just that kind of declaration. He wanted to have more close historical and apostolic ties, so he sought that. He approached the Anglicans as well as the Russian Orthodox community. Anglicans did not want to touch that. They did not want to be involved with that and be seen as connected to this movement. And the Russian bishop was, one, not too keen on this ethnic exclusivism that was part of the church, being primarily for and exclusively to Africans, but also not in a position to do much, being shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. So he couldn't get...
Is he in New York when he's doing all this stuff?
Yeah, he was primarily in New York, that's where he's operating at least. He couldn't get consecrated there, but he did find an interesting character, René Villat, who was himself consecrated by another who was part of the Syro-Jacobite Church. An interesting history there, and he himself was very active in consecrating various people as bishops and founding various churches. We'll see him a little later as well, but he had been the one that consecrated Maguire in giving the African Orthodox Church this sense and this claim, at least, to apostolic succession. But he himself and his churches were kind of repudiated. The recognition of them was taken away in 1938.
What's the Syro-Jacobite Church?
It's a non-Chalcedonian church in communion with the non-Chalcedonian Church of Antioch.
Okay.
So he was actually supposed to be loyal to this non-Chalcedonian Antiochian church in the United States, but instead he operated as this first primate of the old Catholic Church of America, not in communion with the Roman Catholic Church or really much anybody else. He was kind of his own thing.
But by the way, for the record, at any point in history, there are hundreds of this kind of people running around the world with tiny. There was some guy that set up some kind of theoretical cathedral in Mount Carmel when I was there. Of course, they'd abandoned it. He didn't really have any followers. Anyway, go on.
So he himself was pretty active, but that, like I was saying, this is the claim for the African Orthodox Church, the apostolic succession. And it was founded in the United States, but really came to South Africa with this gentleman, William Daniel Alexander, who himself was an Anglican clergyman who had wanted to give some more African independence and something for Africans himself as well. So he had contacted Maguire and had asked for the African Orthodox Church to come to South Africa, which he was consecrated by Maguire and became the first bishop of the African Orthodox Church in South Africa. Like I said, it didn't really last too terribly long or have a lot of close ties with canonical Orthodox Church, like we see with some other countries and some other regions later. But this is good history for some of the other regions that we're going to look at. He had, well, rather, the canonical Orthodox Church does have a presence in South Africa and had, with Father Nicodemus, like I mentioned before, with the first and the most prominent archbishopric being in Johannesburg and founded in 1927. It was something that originally had a geographic jurisdiction of East Africa as well as south, essentially from the equator south of Cape Good Hope. And this is the current hierarchy, as that is the Uganda and Kenya are some of the most prominent places where Orthodoxy really took hold in Eastern Africa and really contributed to Orthodoxy spreading throughout Africa more broadly. We're going to start with Uganda, where is Reuben Sisea Mupasa and Obadiah Basajikitalo, who had really started this movement towards Orthodoxy. in the 1930s. There were two Ugandan men who were Anglicans and had discovered through reading and some Bible study that there were some weird things going on with their church and it wasn't really apostolic. So they did make some contacts. They looked around, sent letters all over the world to try to make contacts with the true church, the apostolic church. And among this, they had made contact with Alexander, who came to Uganda and spent 9 months teaching there, guiding people and baptizing people, including who would become known as Father Reuben Spartas, Lukasic, who had been ordained, and Father Obadiah Wasajikitano, who really helped to establish this African Orthodox Church in Uganda. But again, it was not canonical here in Uganda. As things progressed, Father Nicodemus, or rather Alexander had baptized a daughter of this Greek man who realized, hey, this is an unfamiliar service to me. I don't know what this is. The African Orthodox Church itself having a lot of traditions from the West, largely Anglican and Roman Catholic influence. So he realized this baptism is different. It's not what I, as an Orthodox Christian man, know. So he encouraged the priests, Father Reuben and Father Obadiah, to make contacts with the Patriarchate of Alexandria, which they did. Especially, well, I'm going to cover Father Nicodemus as well, who did visit Uganda. Remember, he was the priest in South Africa who moved to Tanzania, in part because of the tensions regarding his missionary activity outside the Greek community there. So he came from Tanzania and instructed a few men in Uganda, including 4 who were sent off to Alexandria to be instructed and have been ordained, 2 of which returned, or rather they returned to Uganda with Father Irenaeus Magimbi being one that remained there and taught for 10 years. Returning to Father Reuben, he made contact with the Patriarchate of Alexandria in 1946 and had started a conversation there, which led to the Ugandan church being accepted by Patriarch Christophoros II of Alexandria and later consecrated here as the auxiliary bishop, Christopher Spartas of Nilopolis. So, moving on to Kenya. Kenya's history is a little bit different, they had a Roman Catholic and Protestant association with the schools. At this time, pretty much any of the schools had a church affiliation of some sort, and it had a tendency to have the local Kikuyu population, which is one of the tribes in Kenya, to downplay their own local traditions and have them essentially adopt what were British customs, British norms, which they didn't take kindly to. One of the last straws were a mandate, an absolute ultimatum that they needed to repudiate any connection with Kenyan independence from Britain, as well as to repudiate any tradition of female genital mutilation. These were the last straw, and we have 2 Kikuyu associations established. The Kikuyu Karinga Education Association, with Karinga itself having kind of a close meaning, essentially meaning Orthodox in that language, and the Kikuyu Independent School Association. These associations came about by this tradition of Harambee, which is something that still exists in Kenya. It's this kind of cultural notion of Kenyans working for Kenyans for common good. And like I said, it's still persisting today. They had wanted to have a church affiliation. Like I said, a lot of the schools, well, all the schools really did, but their start did not have such an affiliation. They did not want to be connected with any church that had this connection to the colonial powers at the time. So they had made contact with the African Orthodox Church through Alexander, who himself was traveling from Uganda back to South Africa. But in order to do that, he had traveled through Mombasa, towards the coast of Kenya, and a postal clerk spoke with him and asked him what's his deal. And that led to contacts with Jomo Kenyatta, who would become the first president of Kenya, and this contact with the Kikuyu associations. And he came to Kenya, worked there for 16 months, instructing the people, catechizing them, baptizing them, establishing parishes, and so forth, and had two of the first African Orthodox Church priests, two of which left and I believe started these Presbyterian offshoots, two of which remained in the African Orthodox Church to teach the people and so forth in Kenya. So things got a little more tense with the colonial powers, with the United Kingdom, after the Mau Mau Rebellion, where the Kikuyu associations were associated with this rebellion, this uprising for Kenyan independence, and as well as the Orthodox, because the Orthodox were kind of something foreign, not Protestant, not Roman Catholic. Maybe they are doing something for Kenyan independence as well, so they were looked with great suspicion. So after a state of emergency was declared in 1952, the Orthodox Church was banned, temples were closed, a lot of them were burned by the army of Kenya, or at least the British, and they were largely squashed down, with clergy being put into concentration camps. Not too unlike what happened in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution. This was also
How was that? Why did they do that?
because there was this suspicion, also with Roman Catholic and Protestant propaganda, that the Orthodox were somehow involved with this Kenyan uprising, this Kenyan push for independence, which Britain did not like. So they were really banned, prohibited from operating.
Just to be clear here, so these are still sort of this African Orthodox, like non-canonical group in the 50s. Okay.
Yeah. Great. So, move on here. The Archbishop Macarius III of Cyprus, who became later the first president of Cyprus as well, had made some connections with Kenya at this time. He was in exile after some push for independence in Cyprus, and was traveling back to Cyprus through Kenya when he had made contacts there. He had celebrated the liturgy in Nairobi, which the British afterwards were, why did this happen? This should not have happened. Why is this going on? But he himself had preached against colonialism and made some contacts with the local Kenyan population, the African Orthodox Church there, and so forth. And that really brought some kind of a spark of friendship between Jomo Kenyatta and himself, and encouraged the Kenyans and the Orthodox, largely a lot of which were still in prison. So as things progressed, Cyprus gained independence in 1960, with Archbishop Macarius III becoming the first president, and the Jomo Kenyatta becoming the first president of Kenya after its independence from Britain in 1963. And the two of them really had a close friendship. And although Archbishop Macarius was not part of the Patriarchate in Alexandria, as a head of state, he did have contacts in operation in Kenya, which brought him in contact with the Orthodox community there. And at this point, it was something that was in communion with the Patriarch of Alexandria, something that Father Ruben Spartus, I believe, has spurred on, with a lot of kind of influence from Uganda to really become connected to the canonical church, and at this point they were. So as we proceed, Archbishop Macarius III was a large player in the Macarius III Patriarchal Seminary being established in the outskirts of Nairobi, which he had made a push for, to have a kind of a seminary for Africa established. And the friendship between the two of them, Archbishop Macarius and President Jomo Kenyatta, had led to Kenyatta giving a plot of land, intending it to be a personal gift to Archbishop Macarius, who in his wisdom declined it to be a personal gift put under his own name, but rather put it in the Orthodox Church, thus protecting it from kind of any disputes upon his death, which it remains in possession of the Orthodox Church to this day. The foundation stone was laid by Archbishop Macarius in 1971, but with the needing to raise funds and to build up the seminary. It wasn't for some time, even for the patriarchate to be able to provide staff to have it open and operational. So it wasn't until 1982 that they really accepted seminarians for the seminary. And it wasn't until later, until 1995, for Africans beyond Kenya to be accepted to the seminary. As we see, it was Dr. Andreas Tigerides, who was there from the start and served as the principal. There was a determination made that really it should be a bishop that's heading the seminary. So he himself was ordained in 1992 and consecrated as a bishop of Ruta, which is this kind of the outskirt community of Nairobi, where the seminary is located. It is, when I was in Kenya, this was said to be the only Orthodox seminary in the African continent. So it really receives students from all over the continent, from Uganda, Kenya, and so forth. At one point, there's 42 students. I think that number has increased since then. But Archbishop Makarios is the current head of the seminary there, and he is the bishop in residence. If you can go back to the slide. That's actually where he lives, on the grounds of the seminary.
And so, by the way, both Evan and I have met this man.
Yes.
Like, this is
Me too. I talked to him a few times. Yeah.
three of us.
Yeah, when I was, he was our host in Kenya when I was there for a week with Father John Parker of St. Tikhon's and another fellow seminary of mine. So he had been born in Cyprus in 1945, but moved to Kenya in 1979. So really, he has been in Kenya longer now than he had ever been in Cyprus. So he really, born Cypriot, but he is a Kenyan by nature now. He was sent by Makarios III to establish the seminary, and he did a lot of work in preparing it and to getting established. And he is the head of the school, the current Archbishop of Kenya in the Archdiocese of Nairobi. He's had some things like we might see in church history. He was a layperson, and then within just a few days, he was ordained deacon, and then he was ordained priest, and then he's consecrated the bishop. But he's been doing a phenomenal job in Kenya, very beloved by the people, and he loves them dearly as well. He's elevated to the status of a metropolitan of Kenya in Irionapolis, which is now the Archdiocese of Nairobi. This took place in 2001. There's a lot of, we'll see in history, there's a lot of name changes and jurisdiction changes as things became established in Kenya. I have not kept track of how many PhDs and degrees such that Archbishop Makarios has, but he is fluent in many languages and can liturgize just as fluently in Swahili as he does in Greek. It's really impressive to be with him for the services when we were in Kenya. But he had made many accomplishments during his time there, establishing dioceses in multiple regions in Kenya, and he said the establishment of the seminary there. It is now, his diocese in Nairobi is now the second see after Alexandria in the African continent, and the head of Orthodox missions in Africa, which is something that was declared this year, I believe, for him. So moving on from Kenya and Uganda, we come to Tanzania, where Father Nicodemus was very much active. He, like if we remember, he went from South Africa to Tanzania and started his evangelistic outreach there. The fruit of that was a bishopric begun at Bukoba, which is along the coast of Lake Victoria. Largely, there's a lot of interaction between Uganda, its establishment as an Orthodox church, partially due to the work of Father Nicodemus, and the other direction as well for Uganda, the church there, helping establish Tanzania, and it's the Orthodox church there. This is canonical Orthodoxy, where, interesting enough, some of its spread and establishment was through word of mouth, where we have Paul Budala, a factory worker, talking to his co-worker, a Greek man, and asking about religion, where that conversation brought him into awareness of Orthodoxy, where he had become operational in spreading Orthodoxy himself in his area. And this led to baptisms where Father Theodore Nakiamos, later the Metropolitan of Kampala, which is in Uganda, coming to there and baptizing 20 people. So this is the current hierarch of the most prominent diocese in the area is His Eminence Demetrios.
Sorry.
That's right. So East Africa itself, these are not by any means up-to-date numbers, but it's very prominent in Africa for having the spread of the Orthodox Church. We see as of 2004, at least from the information I can gather, there's 400 parishes and around 500,000 faithful, but there has been growth since then. I just do not have up-to-date numbers to really provide. So coming to Zimbabwe, further to the south, this was something that had a similar history to South Africa in regards that it was largely confined to these Greek communities, the Orthodox Church there, until we have this Zimbabwean man, Raphael Ganda, who had gone to Greece for training for the army to become an army officer. And while there, he had come in contact with the Orthodox services held at the army bases there. He became interested, and even upon returning back to Zimbabwe, to the capital of Harare, he had attended the services in the capital city there. From there, Orthodoxy spread. And we have Ganda himself, along with his family, baptized in 1984, and he had been sent off to seminary as well to serve in the rural regions of Zimbabwe, where he had worked on also translating the divine liturgy into Shona, one of the local languages there. And here we have the current hierarch of the most prominent archdiocese of Zimbabwe and Angola, His Eminence Seraphim. Moving westward to the Congo. This had a little different history than some of the other countries we had covered, but in the early 1970s, there was some monastic missionary work with Archimandrite Christos and Papa Sarantopoulos, who had began mission work at the capital with another Archimandrite serving in another region in Congo, in the southeast. Another prominent figure is Father Cosmos, coming to the Congo in 1975 as just a layperson, Ioannis Aslanidis. His work led to the establishment of 9 churches within the span of about 15 months in a lot of villages in the region. And he had not stayed permanently there from the start, but in 1978 went back to Greece, where he met Saint Paisios, who instructed him to be tonsured and to be ordained and returned as a missionary. So that's exactly what he did. And he returned as the head of the missionary work there. Very much beloved man by the locals, and same kind of matter with Archbishop Macarius. He very much loved the local people there as well. And he spent a lot of time catechizing them, instructing them, baptizing the people. He would also send a call out to the local villages that the children gathered, where he would provide instruction to them. And he had, some of his work was not necessarily directly tied to Christian missionary work, but was to serve the needs of the people as well, where he had really developed this agricultural program that had a lot of success in adapting crops for the region that other agricultural programs were unable to do. So he established even the basic material needs of the people there, and baptized 15,000 Africans within a decade. He has a wonderful quote that I want to share. This is part of here. So Father Cosmos said, "Our African brethren are people with inwardness. Europeans usually underestimate them, but they are wrong to do so. The soul of Africans is inclined towards mysticism, and this is why Orthodoxy has something to say to them of a monastic and African type. Because among our African brethren, magic has great power. It is a true demonocracy. Their magicians are very powerful and have great influence. but ultimately Satan exterminates even these. This is why they often resort to Christ, the victor and over all magic, demonic bonds, and spells. In Africa, I saw how true the gospel of Christ is. He had also had this very profound and quote shortly before his death, really, in Africa, where he had said, missionary work is not done for a few months. Whoever wants to be a missionary must leave his bones on African soil, which is exactly what he did. He died in a car crash. An interesting story connected with that is after his death, he had been traveling with the chalice and some other objects of the liturgical items and so forth, which, car crash, they were lost, but these two native men found them, and they didn't know what they were really, but someone, likely Father Cosmos, appeared to them in a vision, instructing them to return into the Orthodox Church, which is what they did. Moving on to Madagascar, we likewise see some monastic missionary work, where in 1953, there was a Greek community already existing there since 1953, but due to local political disturbances, the priests left, leaving it kind of unattended to by the clergy up until 1994, with this call that was sent out. An Australian man, Archimandrite Nectarius Kelly's, heard the call, and he had gone to Madagascar to serve as the priest there. Likewise, like Father Nicodemus, not willing to keep it confined to the Greek community, he did outreach and really taught the Orthodox Christian faith to anybody who was willing to hear it. The first Madagascan priest, Father Iwanis Rakaton Rosali, was ordained by the Metropolitan of Zimbabwe, which is who had jurisdiction over Madagascar originally. We have his ordination of a native man, and also in 1995, the same year, the bringing a nun, Nectaria Paradisi, to assist Father Nectarios. And the Diocese of Madagascar was founded in 1997, more recent, and the first bishop elected for the diocese was Father Nectarios, who himself tragically died in, I believe it was a helicopter crash in 2004, which led to the current hierarch, the most Reverend Metropolitan Ignatius Senis, who's the current Archbishop of the region there in the north. Moving westward to Ghana, we have a story similar to what happened in Uganda, where this man, Grossi Andro, worked to establish this church for Africans and worked to have African Americans come back to their country, was his intent at least. He had established, his group merged with another group which became known as this African Universal Church, but he likewise wanted to have this apostolic tie beyond just something that established locally. So he had made contacts with a man, Churchill Sibley, who himself was and his succession through Rene Fonte. So another connection there. And after this consecration and this work, he renamed the group the African Universal Orthodox Catholic Church, with this kind of the sense that there are other Orthodox churches out there. We don't know where they are, we don't know what they are, but they're there somewhere. But his church led to this period of decline. But they didn't really give up. Where this group that was formerly associated with the Salvation Army in the town of Larte joined this African Universal Orthodox Catholic Church. And they weren't satisfied with the decline, and they established this youth organization, which put a lot of effort into these Orthodox communities that we believe are out there. We need to make contact with them. We need to revitalize our church. We need to make these contacts and get things moving. So they had done this search for the Orthodox Church, and one of the students found in the university library the book The Orthodox Church by Metropolitan Christian Square, which a lot of us are familiar with. And they had heard around the same time, the Orthodox are coming to our country. The World Council of Churches was meeting in Accra to the south, and there's some people, names that we'll recognize, Father John Meindorf, Father Thomas Hopko, the theologian Nicholas Losky, as well as a representative from the Patriarchate, Dr. Raphaelis, that were there, and the representatives from the Orthodox Youth Association organization that they established made contacts with these men, and really got things moving to make these connections and these ties. Out of that, one of the representatives of this youth organization, Joseph Kwame Lally, went to the United States on a scholarship from the Canonical Church and was instructed at St. Vladimir Seminary in Yonkers, New York. He returned back to West Africa, and from it really blossoming from this community in Larta with a youth organization, there was contacts made with Archbishop Irenaeus of the Archdiocese of West Africa at the time, and he had come in 1982, where that town had seen the baptism of 1,500 Ghanaians baptized, and over the next few years, that number had grown to 3,000 people in a lot of the surrounding towns and villages, as well as the ordination of Lavi, who we see here as proto-presbyter, as well as 3 other priests and 3 deacons that serve the area. In Nigeria, to the east, there is this operation of this non-canonical Greek Orthodox Church with origins from an excommunicated Ethiopian non-Chalcedonian church. They had leaders go to Alexandria to make these connections with the canonical Orthodox Church, and that's where they had made some contacts. Metropolitan Irenaeus of Accra from southern Ghana had baptized this group in 1985 and ordained leaders of the group, which led to its operation there as a canonical Orthodox Church. Moving further east to Cameroon and Chad, we have Archbishop Irenaeus again. He became the Metropolitan of Accra in 1976, and this is where he pursued outside the bounds of his immediate region to Cameroon and Chad, largely along the border region where there's this Tubori tribal people that was present there. In 1981, we have where this Tubori man who was interested, he was made a catechist and was ordained to the clergy, and done a lot of work in the rural regions. At first, the language where things operated was French, with things kind of on the fly being translated into the Tubori language. Later on, the language of the services, the texts themselves, were translated into the local language. There was this kind of custom where there was these parties, these garden parties, 3 to 4 times a year at the Archbishop residence, where people were baptized. From this grew the operation of 8 parishes, which as of 1990 at least, they were operating along the border region with Chad, and at least 1 priest operational in Chad doing work. Here is the current Metropolitan, His Eminence Gregory of Cameroon and the Exarch of Central Africa. So, with all these different regions, like I said, just a snapshot, by no means comprehensive, but there's some patterns that come about where really Orthodoxy in Africa, any missionary method, any evangelistic tool that was ever existed, they used it at some point, in some place, at some time. So here's at least some of them that come about. We have the gossip method. Think of like the postal clerk who made contact with Alexander, the bishop of the African Orthodox Church, asking him, what's going on with you? What religion are you? Leading to these contacts with Kenyatta, with the first president of Kenya, a Zimbabwe officer who had heard about Orthodoxy when in Greece. We have the Greek man working in the factory who had his coworker ask about, hey, what's your denomination? What's your religion? Leading to baptisms and the spread of the church there. So really, nothing intentional per se, where there's somebody out preaching or any intentional effort to make contact with the Orthodox Church or really know much about it. It's just questions and people willing to share something that's commendable. We have also the people group approach. Kind of think of St. Paul in Athens preaching to the Athenian people in a way that the Athenian people would receive, kind of referring not as much to like he preached to the Jews, referring to the Torah, referring to the Messiah who was expected, but rather using their own local religion, the shrine to the unknown God, and so forth, to tell the Athenian people about the Lord, and to tell them about Christ. So notably, there was an example of this in the Turkana region in Kenya, where it wasn't, in some Protestant communities, there's this notion of a local church for local people, and so all the people that were coming to that people were of that local people. There was very much a difference with how the Orthodox Church had addressed this with the local people, such that there was a multinational, multi-tribal group that came to the Turkana people and told them about Orthodox Christianity, told them about Christ. As a sign that it's not just the Turkana people, it's not just the Kikuyu people, it's not just Greeks or Jews or anybody else. This faith, this Christ is for everyone, for absolutely every people. And that's exactly what happened with, in that context, it was a blind Turkana man that was translating from English to the Turkana language, what the message was, leading to conversions. So we see this happening in the region. We also see the so-called literature evangelism, where people were not necessarily, reading literature that was designed for evangelism, such as the Orthodox Church by Metropolitan Police Square, but people were just, seeking it out. And this is a phenomenon that's pretty prominent in African communities, where the people were not, it wasn't that missionaries are coming from outside per se and bringing the gospel as we as Orthodox Christians understand it to them. They were seeking it out themselves, and through reading and through study, they just came across the church and started to make contacts. We think of Father Ruben Spartus as an example of that, where he sent out just letters all over the place trying to make contact with the Apostolic Church, as well as other examples. We also have the example of miracles. Really something that you might see on the pages of the New Testament, where people that were, ill were healed through prayer and faith. People that were demonically possessed were set free through prayer. Like a few examples here. So in Tanzania, near Bukoba, a priest, Father Sosthenes Kiyonga, came to the village in 1974 to teach the Orthodox faith. The people there at the time had to walk 8 kilometers to fetch water. A good deal of labor to get just fresh water for the people to drink. So Father Sosthenes prayed, and a spring appeared in the village, which has not dried up since then. So this kind of thing. I'm not sure if this might have been through, I can't remember where I got it from, whether it was from traveling in Kenya or something that Father had mentioned to me, but there was an example of a white priest that came to a tribal region where, he was going to spread the gospel and preach, but there was the tribal people there, oddly enough, that just received him very warmly and very readily, because what had happened was the leader of the group was akin to a shaman, had seen a vision of this white person come to the people, and that was going to teach them about God, teach them this truth from God. So when this white man appeared and started teaching the Orthodox faith, all the people expected him, and they received it readily. And I believe that in the same case, the people were ready for baptism, but it was during the dry season, and there wasn't a whole lot of water there, but they prayed, and enough rainfall came that there was enough water for the people to be baptized. So miracles like this happened. One more example I'll give for now is an Anglican school where a school teacher had a problem with pupils being bewitched in the high school where he taught. An Orthodox charismatic evangelist, Charles Omurko, who had been working out of Western Kenya, came to the school and prayed for the pupils where they were healed from this kind of demonic bewitching. So things like this led to the spread of the church. As well as monastic missionaries. We think of Archimandrite Chrysostomos, who worked in Madagascar. This is his grave here, buried in Madagascar. We think of Father Cosmos, who had worked in the Congo, who's likewise also buried there. We think of Father Nicodemus Sarakas in South Africa and Tanzania, all the labors that they did. In the course of Orthodox history in the Byzantine Empire and Russia, this is probably one of the more prominent missionary methods we see, is people from the monasteries going out to preach the gospel and to teach the people and to bring the gospel to others. St. Herman of Alaska being an example of this in North America as well. And this is something that also took place in Africa. Another method, probably one of the most prominent ones from what I saw in my time in Kenya, I don't know if Father Ignatius might have different experience, is this the sense of education and service. With this understanding that Christ did not come just to save disembodied souls, but he came to heal people, soul and body, and to really care for the whole man. So with this brought education, brought health services. This is the day I arrived in Kenya. We went to liturgy, within just a few hours of arriving there, flying overnight, arriving to Kamende, going to liturgy in the parish there, and afterwards walking across the street to this hospital and this health clinic where there's maternity services, lab services for just the local population to provide them with care that they needed. Here's Archbishop Macarius as well, talking to a mother and a child. I'm not going to get into too much detail of what happened there. But we see that in a lot of the other places throughout Kenya and other places, such as Father Cosmos in the Congo, establishing an agricultural program, not really, limiting to just spiritual things or just care for the soul, but just caring for people, have love for neighbor and love for God. Brings us to the question of really what happens when the Orthodox Christian faith encounters a different culture. Here's a picture from a time in Kenya among the Maasai people, a tribal group that has some fame in Kenya, but also some concern as tribal people that the Kenyan government left behind, didn't really invest in, so they would become this kind of tourist attraction, essentially. So what do we do when we find people are not familiar with Christianity, not familiar with the gospel? How does the gospel interact with that? So one of the kind of the outlooks that Archbishop Macarius and a lot of people working in mission work come to see is this importance of speaking the language of the local people. And this is something that's been prominent throughout Orthodox history, even with speaking the local dialect. Slavonic with the Slavic people. We have English services here in the United States, something that's not combined to just an ancient language like Latin or Greek or Slavonic, but something that adapts to the people so they could hear the gospel in their own language. This is something that's important in Kenya and throughout, we've seen where the language was, I think it's over 60 languages, local languages and Swahili, that the liturgy and the gospel is translated to, Swahili being this kind of more broad commercial and trade language for Africa, with many just local dialects and local languages that may or may not have much similarity to one another. So it's very important to have it in the local languages. But the gospel, encountering people beyond that, has really these three operations, one of which is to accept what is already good and beautiful and true amongst the people. Kind of think of, the St. Justin Martyr having the concept of the spermaticus logos, where all people are made in the image of God. So really truth cannot be eradicated as much as it, may be distorted. There's something always good there that can be drawn out to fullness in the Orthodox Christian faith. So this is where some elements are accepted and, brought in and affirmed. There's also the element where some things that are just contrary, that cannot jive with the Orthodox Christian faith, are just in complete contradiction to the gospel, and these elements just are rejected. They have to be set aside, not to be picked up again, and really struggled against in some form or another, so that this is not something that is carried on with the people of God in the church, and especially for the health and good order of the people, the local people themselves. Not in a sense of you must conform to us, but as a liberation. These are things that are holding you back. These are things that are keeping you in bondage. We need to set these aside. And as well as transfusing the culture with new elements. Here, this picture is from a liturgy that I was present in, and afterwards there was the memorial service, which it was a local person, if memory serves me, a local person who had died, but it's like the entire community that was present for the memorial service, bringing candles and bread and other goods, kind of an offering in remembrance of the person and for the community. And this is something that was not foreign to the local people. They would have these kind of gatherings, these meals, in some, painting with broad strokes. Some of the religious traditions understood death and would have prayers upon the death of a person and as a memorial to them. Is something that was kind of baptized, but in the context of Orthodoxy and with new elements brought in. So, like I was saying, with accepting some elements and some adaptations for the local people, we see, for example, in Africa, the African language. We see African traditions, African songs and music brought in. This is a liturgy that I was in where there was also a harambe going on. Kind of a lot of the parishes gathering for the common good of the people to raise money for some cause and for the good of the church in the region. Not itself without its own issues, kind of in its current form in Kenya. We're not going to get too much in detail with that. But here they were with African songs and drumming. This picture itself was after the liturgy had ended, with this drumming and traditional African songs, music being sung while a collection was being done for the cause. Prior to this, during clergy communion, I don't have a picture here, but I do have a picture of it if you ask me for it. There's a drum set off to the north side by the altar at the iconostas, where during clergy communion, this little boy, still, in the Sicarian for the altar serving as an altar server, came out and sat at the drums and played the drums while there was some more traditional songs being sung during clergy communion. It's not the norm in every place in Africa, but it's a phenomenon as it adapts to the culture and brings in elements of culture into the church. As well as the faithful having their own traditional names, not discarding them, and so forth.
Do they still take patron saint names, or?
I believe so, but I do not have a lot of direct recollection of that.
Okay.
To say it with a whole lot of confidence. But a lot of the missionary work being done, they see a people already prepared and ready to receive the gospel. For example, generalizing quite a bit, but a lot of the African traditional religions, they already have this concept of one creator, almighty God, with maybe some lesser spirits and spirits of the ancestors that they go to for veneration, but they already have this concept of a single God over all, who sustains life and who is the authority ultimately of all things. They have this concept that God is not tied to a particular structure or particular places, particular dates and times, as well as belief in life beyond death and these traditional values of justice, morality, this honesty, and so forth that plays out in the community with this kind of strong cultural concept of everyone having a part to play, everybody having some responsibility within the community, and going from there. You know, they have as well the various rites and sacrifices, priesthood, really a deep sense of the sacred and this connection between the unseen and nature as is seen perceptively. So, more on the kind of local religion, there's, broadly speaking, there's not a lot of idolatry, strictly speaking itself, where there's this worship, these sacrifices with idols present. A lot of sacrifices in some of the traditional religions that have encountered or heard about there is done under maybe a sacred tree, but not to a statue or so forth. And a lot of it maybe a matter of translation matters, but not so much of a polytheistic religion as much as it is veneration of maybe local ancestor spirits, asking for their intercessions and so forth. So as I mentioned before, the spermaticos logos, this concept of there being some seed of the truth there, with the Word of God operating amongst all people to some extent, not in the fullness per se, as much as not in the fullness we have in the Orthodox Church, but some amount of good and truth and beauty in any culture. We see these connections between African spirituality and the fullness that missionaries bring it to, and bringing the Orthodox Christian faith there is not so much of a, this is wrong, do this other thing, but hey, this is what it is in its fullness, this is what you have, and this is how it is more fully. So the intercession of the ancestors is an example. They would ask for the intercession of the ancestors for protection, where are these totems, like these items, or go to these places where there's some significance for that person, in places where that ancestor had seen success in life. These are seen as these good totems, these good personal belongings that they would wear in seeking the intercessions of their ancestors. Bring it to its fullness, you have, instead of, asking for the intercessions of these ancestors, let's go to the intercessions of the saints, the holy people that we know are in this deep communion with God, and the angels, and to turn to them. And you don't need to wear, per se, these items, these personal belongings of your ancestors. You can wear the cross, which has power for Christ beyond that. You don't have to, venerate these good totems, but you can venerate the relics of the saints, venerate the cross, and these things that were, the Africans seen as gifts, the totems themselves as gifts from the Supreme Spirit, but understand as being infused with the grace of God and having power there, which, himself, the Trinity being the Supreme Spirit that the Africans had already believed in, similar to how St. Paul preached to the Athenians. But it's not without these negative expressions, these negative elements in African culture. Pictured here is an orphanage where there was each of these beds, these mattresses, had been a place of rest for 5 to 6 children each, where they were brought for refuge from some negative cultural elements. This orphanage, for example, Father Tito, one of the first Maasai priests in Kenya, running this orphanage and bringing children to it from some of the really negative aspects of Maasai culture. For example, children that were blind at birth or had eyesight problems were left out to die or to just kind of be imprisoned in the huts, and really seen as people. Like they were treated with such inhumane ways that the children were rescued from some of these villages, sometimes with the government that Father Tito would have some connections with for protection and so forth, as of course the Maasai did not take this lightly, having the curse remaining rather than being killed off. Having these places of refuge for them. There's also some aspect of human sacrifice, maybe exaggerated in some historical accounts, but it is present in Africa, has been, in some aspects such as female genital mutilation, which is also something that happened among the Maasai people. Aspects that really should be cut out. Polygamy is also a problem in a lot of the African cultures, sometimes tied very closely with economics, such that the more wives you have, the more you have help on the farm. We're harvesting the crops so that they can be brought to the man, the husband, to sell in the market. But with some changes in the culture, or collective farming and so forth, there's less of an economic need for that, so it's not happening as much. In some cases, in some places, a man comes to the Orthodox Church wanting to be baptized with many wives. He would select one to keep as a wife who would be married in the church, the rest of which wouldn't be abandoned, but would live as sisters amongst his household, and opened, free to marry another man if they so chose and so saw fit, but still tended to and cared for. Other places, it's something that's treated more on a generational level, where maybe the first generation of Christians might have multiple wives, but the second generation after that, you see less of that. Maybe the third generation, there wouldn't be multiple wives, there would be one man and one woman. So you see that. Some of the local religion as well, that kind of ancestor veneration and spiritism that I was mentioning before, kind of a corruption of people's natural inclination to the Holy Spirit, into this kind of different and demonic thing that also has a part in magic and witchcraft, where you'd see bad magic per se, where it's magic that was against somebody for destruction, for for their death, whatever the case is, a curse upon somebody, with people going to these magicians and protective magic, which sometimes to form wearing these totems as kind of the amulet against this magic, but also this good magic where it's for the good of people, maybe good for the crops, good for finding a spouse, whatever the case is, but in any case, all of which must be understood and is taught is demonic, all of it. There's always a cost, always some tie to Satan and the demons, so none of it is to be accepted. So it's not accepted into the church. Some of the people go to the church for refuge from it, and finding protection upon the baptism there. Some of which trying to go to the church to destroy from the inside out, which doesn't happen with success because on one level, upon approaching the church for this, this physical burning sensation, upon being in the church, received into it, and trying to practice magic, likewise being burned by it. And that's often the point where people would go to repentance and turn over their magician tools, these magical implements, over to the priest where they would be burned. And regardless of whether people would be sought out or seeking out the church for refuge from this magic, or later on repenting after the fact because they didn't really have pure intentions, they would be instructed and encouraged to have communion frequently as this protection from Christ against that demonic influence. So kind of looking at the history as well, looking at Orthodoxy's appeal, there is this understanding that it's not connected rather to these colonial powers that really tried to eradicate the local traditions. But the Orthodox Church seemed that accepted what was good, like I was saying, and adapted things so that they weren't eliminated as their own individual people group coming to Christ, but allowed to be their own people in Christ, and being brought to their fullness, and having Christian culture really help them. There's also the otherworldly character of the church and of the Christianity that they came to see in the Orthodox Church, that they maybe saw as on some level familiar from what they had in their past life, For example, even in this image here is the funeral I attended when I was in Kenya for the mother of one of the priests. She had moved away from the Orthodox Church, not in intention, just for, I believe, some other circumstances led her to move away, but not in faith. But locally there was a Protestant community that she had some involvement with. So the funeral had a lot of Protestants with a lot of elements from that, a lot of singing, dancing, and DJ. A lot of things that were different from my experience. But then came our party with Archbishop Macarius, who led the funeral service in an Orthodox manner, which was very profound and very different from everything else that went on. Afterwards, driving on the road, he kind of casually said, "Oh, a lot of cases like this, the priest will come to us and say, we want to be Orthodox." And we were like, okay, Your Eminence, sure. But I think it was just a day or two later, he was quietly in the front seat on his phone, had a conversation. Upon its conclusion, he turned to us and said, "That was the Protestant pastor of that community. They want to be Orthodox." So we saw it. It was also something that, from a lot of the cases we've covered, that there was this recognition of this apostolic tradition which is preserved in the church that is not so seen in other places. You know, things like fasting, liturgical worship, all these elements that are lacking in other traditions that is not lacking in the Orthodox Church, as well as some of the miracles and the protection from demonic forces, really being a refuge in this place, this liberation that Christ brings to the people in a very clear way that is not seen as much, really not seen elsewhere. Some of my sources here, in no particular order, as well as some books that are good if anybody's interested in learning more about Orthodoxy in the continent of Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them are hard to get because they are out of print, which I ran into in my research, but some of which may be more readily available. And as is said in Swahili for thank you, asante for listening, and Mungu mtukufu aliye Bwana, all glory to God.
Thank you very much.
Any questions?
So you mentioned about the differences of languages. So how exactly does the seminary teach? I mean, is the seminary in Swahili and does everything just done in Swahili so when they go back to their communities, or do they try to incorporate other languages? You said they come from all different countries.
Right. Swahili, it serves as a kind of connection because whether a person is from the Kikuyu tribe or from the Turkana tribe or from across the continent, Swahili has this kind of common language that everybody kind of knows to some extent, maybe more or less in some degree. But from that common base, and English in a lot of places is also common language. A lot of the materials they gather, it's not, there's a lot of poverty in a lot of these communities, so it's a lot of getting what we can. And so a lot of the books in the library, for example, are in English because that's what has been donated, that's what was available.
In Africa, I mean, generically, like you can say that a lot of Africa can be divided up into Anglophone countries and Francophone countries, depending on who the colonial power was there. And I mean, like when I was in Kenya, there's a lot of English around. Even like the Paschal Divine Liturgy that I was there for. So I was there on Holy Week and Pascha and Bright Week. I mean, it was maybe 10% of it that was in English, but like 10% of it was in English, so certainly made me feel right at home.
Yeah, but it's also the work of the seminary itself that a lot of the seminarians have been involved in the translation of the texts and the gospel into some of the more regional languages. So that's all I can say.
mentioned no canonical churches being around. Are these still around, or have at least most of them become canonical?
It varies probably on region. There are some places where there was splintering from schismatic groups, like old calendarist groups having some influence and some operation in Africa, for example, and maybe some of those kind of startup groups that were supposed to be Orthodox churches, but were canonically and historically not, that were became in communion with those other like schismatic bodies. So it still has some presence there. There's the tragic recent occurrences with the Russian Orthodox Church as well, having some presence in the African continent, even though it's canonically under the Patriarchate of Alexandria. So there are things like that happen, as well as the non-Chalcedonian churches. Ethiopia having some operation and things like that. There is some presence. It's not that all fell within canonical orthodoxy, but a good portion has and is.
I'm curious, in some cases, a lot of our even maybe Western Orthodoxy, sometimes we try to push maybe there in Africa. I'm curious from your experience that you went there, anything you saw in the Orthodox communities that you think we could learn from here?
There were some interesting questions that were raised from some of our travels in Kenya. For example, and some of it may be controversial, but what do you do, for example, bringing Orthodoxy to the Maasai people? And something that may have a difference in opinions. I believe maybe outside of Kenya it's done differently, but the Maasai themselves are a nomadic people, for example. They build their homes out of mud and dung from their cattle and grass, and in 6 months' time or whenever they lose feed for their cattle in the local region, they will up and move somewhere else. So it's not perhaps the most practical of things to build one building to say, hey, this is where everybody has to gather, because they're nomadic people. This is something that was happening, at least from our experience in Kenya, where there was a physical church building, a permanent building set up, but not necessarily the only way it has to be done. There's some other denominations, non-Orthodox denominations that had something more akin to the tabernacle that we see in the Old Testament, moving along with the people. I believe Father Tito, one of the first Maasai, I believe he may have been the first Maasai priest in Kenya, if memory serves me right, if not one of the first. He himself intended to travel along with the Maasai people, but because of the orphanage, during a time of civil war, he had just a bunch of families bringing children to him, thinking, oh, he's a priest, no one's going to cause harm to this place, let's bring our children there. And this was the kind of the beginnings of the orphanage that he still manages, but because of the orphanage, he's kind of stuck in roots with a permanent temple. But you see for the picture, for example, of Archbishop Makarios and Father Tito, I didn't point him out per se, but he was the one in the blue shuka, which is the cloth that the Maasai people wrap themselves in. He was wearing kind of Western style clothes underneath and a blue shuka over top. His brother was in that picture, who is an Orthodox Christian, still wearing a shuka just like any Maasai person would. So like things like cultural like clothing, there's no like mandate that you have to change this now in order to become an Orthodox Christian. But kind of seeing where the local people can have their traditions, retain them, and still be an Orthodox people. Other questions like, what does it look like? Do they need to per se do Vespers in the Byzantine style? Do they have to swing at censer just like is in the Byzantine tradition? These kind of perhaps more controversial questions were brought up with no clear answer. But
Do they swing the censer differently?
not that I know of.
I was
Except for
curious when
I
you
mean,
saying that.
it was Greek liturgical traditions are brought there, so
Yeah.
things different than may be done in the OC. That's just how things are done in the Greek churches, but adaptations made. The buildings were not necessarily all grand in all places and all times. There was a local priest in the community that people would have to walk to, I think, 2 hours, an hour to 2 hours to get to the liturgy. Because of infirmity or whatever the case is, some people would not go. So the priest had a motorcycle that he would be driving communion to the faithful elsewhere. But, having the precious and holy body of the Lord on a motorcycle, not ideal. So he was raising funds to get a van to be a little safer. For
Did you get a motorcycle ride out there?
I did not.
I did. I learned that when you're in a cassock, you got to gird up your loins, otherwise you're going to get sucked into the back wheel of that thing.
Oh, yeah.
But it became a question. Like Father Tito, jumping back to him, I only saw him in a cassock once, and he kind of apologetically, not that it was needed, but he said that he'd wear it more, but it was just so hard to get a cassock. So we were wondering, like, hey, you have beautiful shuka fabrics. Can a cassock be made out of that? And I don't know if it ever occurred to him. He kind of laughed and said, maybe. So that might not be a clear answer to your question per se, but things like is brought up in mission fields. Some good questions.
Be even more controversial than the short red-headed priest that my wife knew that wore a bright green cassock all the time. And I have no idea who that was, but I guess she said that he was referred to sometimes behind his back as Father Leprechaun.
Yes.
So kind of a two-pronged question. Dealing with poverty in many of these villages, first of all, how does funding work? Does the See of Alexandria provide funding for churches, or does the local village just do the best they can? Or does their money come from Greece or other countries? And then the second thing would be, with levels of poverty and malnutrition, do they have different fasting rules, or do they still get the exact same fasting rules, but it just, I don't know, how does that work?
It depends. Next question. Really, it's something that does depend, to be honest. For example, in Kenya, when we were there, perhaps scandalous, but we were there during the Dormition fast. There wasn't a whole lot of Lenten foods provided to us. The people, they were living in poverty, so a lot of their diet is the goats they raise, the milk that they get from their livestock. That's what they have. And maybe things are different in different regions. But that was the reality of the people of Kenya at the time that we traveled there and the places that we went to. Other places, for example, in the Congo, fasting is much more prevalent. Even to the extent that a priest that was interviewed that came from the Congo, currently serving in, I believe it's in Athens, somewhere in Greece, but he had spoke of the Orthodox. They're known as, he's Orthodox. He fasts on Wednesdays and Fridays. So it's much more known and much more kind of wide knowledge and much more practice in that region. So it really is something that depends on that level. In terms of funding, likewise, also something that depends. So, for example, in Kenya, you have the concept of the Harambee, where the local people would gather funds from the local people. Tithing is a phenomenon that is also, to some extent, maybe overplayed, kind of the way we more popularly think of it, funds from elsewhere. So, for example, the Church of Finland was very, very influential in the Orthodox Church being established in East Africa, providing funds, providing materials, all that kind of stuff. So that's what I can say. Anyway.
All right, well, thank you very much, Deacon Simon, for providing us this education. We look forward. It's only 2 short weeks, and you'll be doing another presentation on despondency and what was it? Despondency and
Despondency in the spiritual life.
despondency in the spiritual life. So thank you once again. The heavens are being strange one more time. But, right, well, let's sing. It is truly me, and we shall depart.